He just wanted to be respected, but learned that respect starts within. Chapter 1: A Life Spent Seeking Approval. From the moment he could remember, Thomas measured his worth by how others reacted to him. In school, he learned quickly that a well-timed joke or a compliment to a teacher earned smiles and approval. At home, he tried to anticipate what his parents wanted, getting good grades not because he cared about learning, but because it brought him praise. Over time, this pattern became his default way of living. As an adult, the habit deepened. At work, he took on extra tasks, stayed late, and even agreed to ideas he didn't believe in, all to maintain his good guy reputation. In friendships, he avoided expressing opinions that might cause disagreement. In relationships, he overextended himself, always putting the other person's needs ahead of his own, thinking that was the way to earn love. Outwardly, people admired him. Thomas is so easygoing, so reliable. But internally, he felt invisible to himself. His life was a performance, a constant shape-shifting to match the expectations of whoever stood in front of him. The scary part was that he didn't know what he actually liked, valued, or wanted. His identity had become a reflection of other people's preferences, and deep down, he sensed that this relentless pursuit of approval was eroding something essential: his own self-respect. He didn't realize it yet, but the very thing he was chasing, respect, was impossible to get from others until he learned to give it to himself first. This silent truth was the seed of a transformation he hadn't even imagined. Chapter 2: The Moment That Shattered His Illusion. The turning point came on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday at work. Thomas had been working tirelessly for weeks on a project that wasn't even his responsibility, stepping in after a colleague fell behind. He stayed late most nights, skipped lunches, and even canceled plans with friends to make sure everything was perfect. He told himself this was his chance to finally prove his value and earn the respect he'd been craving from his boss and peers. When presentation day arrived, Thomas walked into the meeting room with a mix of exhaustion and hope. He delivered the results clearly, every slide polished, every detail accounted for. The room was silent for a moment and then nothing. His boss skimmed through his work in seconds, barely acknowledging it before moving on to the next chapter. Not a single thank you, not a nod of appreciation, not even a glance in his direction. In that instant, a cold wave of realization washed over him. All his extra effort had meant more to him than it did to anyone else in that room. The validation he had been chasing simply wasn't coming. Not from them, not in the way he imagined. That night, lying awake in bed, he replayed the moment over and over. He started to see a pattern. Every time he bent over backwards for someone, hoping for their approval, it either went unnoticed or was taken for granted. It wasn't just this one meeting, it was his whole life. And that awareness cut deep. For the first time, Thomas began to wonder, if I keep living like this, will I ever feel truly respected? Or am I building my life on a foundation that will never hold? This painful moment didn't give him answers yet, but it cracked the shell of his illusion. And through that crack, a new kind of truth began to seep in. Chapter 3: Realizing the Source of Respect. The days after that meeting were heavy. Thomas still went to work, still greeted people with a polite smile, but inside he felt hollow. He kept thinking about the way he had placed his entire sense of worth into other people's reactions, as if their opinion was the only mirror that could tell him who he was. It was exhausting, and for the first time he admitted to himself that it wasn't working. One evening, while scrolling aimlessly through his phone, he came across a short interview clip of a retired athlete he admired. The man was talking about respect. Not the kind you demand, but the kind you carry within yourself. If you don't respect yourself first, the athlete said, no amount of applause will fill the gap. People treat you as a reflection of how you treat yourself. Something about that line hit Thomas like a quiet thunderbolt. He realized that for years, he had been treating himself as someone who was only valuable if others said so. Every time he overextended himself, neglected his needs, or silenced his own opinions to avoid conflict, he was confirming to himself, and to the world, that his value depended on outside approval. He started looking back on moments from his life with new eyes. The times he had agreed to things he didn't want to do, the times he had stayed silent when he should have spoken up, the times he had let his boundaries dissolve because he feared rejection. All of it pointed to the same truth. He had never learned to stand in his own respect. It wasn't an easy realization. In fact, it felt like standing in front of a mirror for the first time and finally seeing the cracks. But in that discomfort, there was also a strange sense of power. Because if the lack of self-respect was the problem, maybe, just maybe, he could change it. And that possibility lit the first small flame of hope inside him. Chapter 4: The Turning Point. The real turning point didn't happen in some grand, cinematic moment. It was a small, almost invisible decision. A week after that realization, Thomas found himself in a familiar situation. A colleague asked him to stay late and help with a project that wasn't his responsibility. In the past, he would have automatically said yes, even if it meant skipping dinner or losing sleep. That reflex to please was almost muscle memory. But this time, he paused. The pause felt like an eternity. His heart raced, and the old fear began to creep in. If I say no, will they think I'm selfish? Will they like me less? But underneath that anxiety was a quieter, stronger voice. You've been here before. You know where saying yes takes you. You deserve to matter in your own life. He took a breath and said, I can't tonight, but I hope it goes well. Let me know how I can help tomorrow. It was such a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of years of unspoken boundaries. His colleague nodded and moved on. The world didn't end. No one stormed out or labeled him a bad teammate. In fact, the relief he felt was so profound it was almost disorienting. That night, walking home, Thomas realized something powerful. Respect didn't start when others recognized his worth. It started the moment he acted in alignment with it. Every time he honored his limits, spoke his truth, or protected his time, he wasn't just demanding respect from others. He was showing himself that he was worth protecting. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but that single act became a seed. And like any seed, it needed to be watered through repeated choices. Saying no when necessary, speaking up even when his voice shook, choosing his own well-being over the comfort of pleasing everyone. That was the moment Thomas stopped chasing respect like a distant prize and began building it from within. And for the first time, he started to feel what true respect actually felt like. Steady, quiet, and unshakable. Chapter 5: The Shift in Mindset. Once Thomas experienced that first taste of setting a boundary without the world collapsing, something inside him clicked. For years, he had been operating under the belief that respect was something other people granted you if you behaved a certain way, if you were agreeable enough, helpful enough, likable enough. But now he began to see that respect was less about convincing others and more about the way you carry yourself. He started to question the silent rules he had been living by. Why had he assumed that other people's needs were always more important than his own? Why did being nice mean swallowing his truth? And most importantly, why did he believe that saying no made him less of a good person? The answers weren't comfortable. They were rooted in old fears of rejection and a deep craving for external approval. But instead of running from those realizations, Thomas sat with them. He journaled about moments in his past when he had ignored his own needs to earn someone's favor, and how empty it had left him. He began to notice patterns not just in his relationships with others, but in how he treated himself. With time, he started to flip the equation. Instead of asking, will they respect me if I do this? He began asking, will I respect myself if I do this? That simple shift changed everything. It affected the way he spoke. More direct, less apologetic. It changed how he made decisions. He weighed them against his values, not just the expectations of others. And it even altered his posture. He walked a little taller, not with arrogance, but with a quiet assurance that he no longer needed everyone's approval to feel worthy. The surprising part? As Thomas respected himself more, others seemed to respect him more too. Not because he had mastered some manipulative tactic, but because people naturally respond to someone who values themselves. Respect had stopped being a prize he chased and had become the byproduct of a deeper truth. You teach the world how to treat you by the way you treat yourself. That mindset became his compass, guiding him in every interaction, every choice, and every challenge. It wasn't always easy, but it was real. And for Thomas, real was worth far more than being liked. Chapter 6: Building New Habits of Self-Respect. After Thomas's mindset shifted, he realized that understanding the importance of self-respect was only the beginning. If he wanted it to stick, he needed to turn it into a daily practice, something that showed up not just in moments of big decisions, but in the quiet, ordinary choices that built his life. The first habit he worked on was setting clear boundaries. This didn't just mean saying no to things he didn't want to do. It meant taking the time to understand why he was saying no. He learned to check in with himself before agreeing to anything, asking, "Does this align with my priorities? Will this drain me or support me?" This self-check became second nature, and soon, he found himself committing only to things that truly mattered. The second habit was self-talk. For years, his inner voice had been his harshest critic, replaying every mistake and telling him he wasn't enough. Now, whenever that voice appeared, he would consciously replace it with something constructive. Instead of, "You're going to fail at this," he would tell himself, "You're capable, and even if you stumble, you'll learn." This wasn't blind positivity, it was a commitment to treat himself with the same compassion he gave others. He also developed the habit of following through on promises to himself. If he said he'd go for a run in the morning, he went. If he decided to finish a project by Friday, he met the deadline. These small acts of consistency built a deep trust in himself, the kind of trust that made him feel grounded no matter how others saw him. Another habit was surrounding himself with people who mirrored his new values. He began to distance himself from relationships where respect was one-sided, and instead spent time with friends and mentors who encouraged him to grow. These connections reinforced his progress and made it harder to slip back into old patterns. Lastly, he practiced stillness. Whether through meditation, journaling, or simply sitting quietly with a cup of coffee, Thomas carved out moments to reconnect with himself. These pauses became anchors, reminders that his worth wasn't tied to constant doing or pleasing. Over time, these habits didn't just change the way he treated himself, they reshaped his entire life. Respect was no longer an abstract concept or a fleeting feeling. It was a lifestyle woven into every word, action, and decision. And it all started with the simple, powerful choice to stop abandoning himself. Chapter 7: The Shift in How Others Treated Him. As Thomas deepened his habits of self-respect, he began noticing something surprising. The world around him seemed to respond differently. The same people who once dismissed his ideas or took advantage of his kindness were now pausing to listen, weighing his words with more seriousness. It wasn't that they had suddenly changed, it was that he had. Before, Thomas's need for approval had been almost invisible but somehow always detectable. People could sense that he would bend over backward to keep them happy, so they subconsciously treated him like someone whose boundaries were negotiable. Now, his energy was different. He carried himself with quiet certainty, not arrogance, not defensiveness, just an unshakable sense of where he stood. In conversations, he no longer rushed to fill silences or agree just to smooth over discomfort. He spoke with intention, and when he disagreed, he did so calmly and without apology. This subtle shift made people trust him more. They saw that his words had weight, because he wasn't trying to please anyone at the cost of truth. At work, colleagues who used to offload their tasks onto him started asking before assuming he'd say yes. Some even began respecting his time more, scheduling meetings in advance instead of interrupting him in the middle of his work. In his personal life, friends who had once leaned on him without giving back started showing up for him in return, or, in some cases, drifted away entirely. He didn't resent those departures. Instead, he saw them as proof that his new boundaries were acting like a filter, keeping in only those who valued him. Even strangers seemed to pick up on the change. When he walked into a room, he didn't shrink or scan for cues on how to fit in. He simply occupied his space, and people responded to that quiet confidence. Some greeted him with more warmth, others with more caution, but almost everyone treated him with more respect than before. The most profound shift, though, wasn't in how others spoke to him, it was in how they looked at him. There was a different kind of eye contact now, one that said, "I see you, I take you seriously." And the truth was, they could only see him that way because, for the first time in his life, he saw himself that way too. Chapter 8: The Realization that Respect Starts Within. It wasn't a single moment that made Thomas understand this truth. It was a gradual unfolding. like a lens slowly coming into focus. For most of his life, he had believed respect was something others gave you if you proved yourself enough. If you worked harder, said the right things, dressed the right way, or kept everyone happy. But after months of living with his new boundaries, something clicked. Respect wasn't a prize handed out by other people. It was a reflection of how you treated yourself. He realized that before, he had been asking the world for something he had never given himself. He wanted others to value his time, yet he constantly wasted it on things that didn't matter to him. He wanted others to take his opinions seriously, yet he second-guessed his own thoughts before even speaking them out loud. He wanted others to trust him, yet he often betrayed himself by saying yes, when his whole body was screaming no. Now things were different. Self-respect had become his foundation, not just a concept he'd read about in a book. It showed up in the way he spoke to himself when he made mistakes, not with harsh criticism, but with patience and accountability. It appeared in the small rituals he kept every day. Waking up early to have time for himself before work, eating in a way that nourished his body, turning down invitations when he needed rest, and surrounding himself only with people whose presence felt mutual and genuine. The world mirrored this change back to him. Opportunities that once slipped past him began showing up, not because people suddenly became generous, but because they recognized something solid in him, something reliable. The irony wasn't lost on him. The less he chased other people's respect, the more freely it seemed to come. In quiet moments, Thomas would look back at the version of himself who bent and folded to fit everyone else's expectations. He didn't hate that version. In fact, he felt compassion for him because he now understood that desperate need to be liked was only the symptom of a deeper wound, one that could only be healed from within. And so, the lesson was clear: respect is never really about convincing others. It's about living in a way that makes you impossible to ignore, not because you're loud or forceful, but because you stand firmly in who you are. In Thomas's case, the journey to earn the world's respect ended the day he learned to give it to himself first.